Hey everybody, welcome to another day of live streaming with AP World History. If you're anything like me, you've had a great day because Beyonce released new music. So, I mean, a song, but still, what a song. I've only listened to it like 25 to 30 times so far, so I don't really feel like I know the song the way I'd like to. But yes, check it out if you haven't already. It's called the Savage Remix with Megan Thee Stallion, but it does not feel like a remix at all because it's basically like a totally new song. So go check it out. Anyway, I'm Chad Smith. I am from Irving, Texas, MacArthur High School. Yesterday, the other AP World History live teacher, Mr. Logereau, tried to get a little shady and say that he was cooler than me because of living in Austin. But I think I'll take a moment to remind Mr. Logereau that he lives near Austin. He lives in Pflugerville. And I really can't think of anything cool about Pflugerville. But I'd also say we're two old white dudes from Texas. So I don't know why we're arguing about who's cooler when the truth is basically everybody else is cooler. Anyway, we're here today not to talk about me and Mr. Logereau, but to talk about AP World History and to do some review and preparation, and particularly to talk about Unit 6, which is Imperialism. Before we do that, I want to take a minute to remind you that you have about 7 DBQs that you can practice even without your teacher making them available to you. And these DBQs are in AP Classroom, and they're available to you right now. If you're in your AP Classroom home screen, you can go to at the top where these arrows are, you can go and find several of them. But I want to let you know that these questions, these DBQs, are not necessarily edited to match how your actual DBQ will look on May 21st at 1 p.m. Central Time. Now, of course, if it's not 5 o'clock where you are right now, then you don't have Central Time. So check with your teacher and find out what time you'll be taking the test. So there might be more than 5 documents, and you might see a prompt that looks something like this. This prompt has additional assignments that you will not get. So this last question, I'm not even going to read it out loud, but there are several prompts in this AP practice with this question on it, and I have 2 really important words for you. Ignore it. Don't do this, ignore it because it doesn't matter. This assignment is about as old as Mr. Logereau, which means to say it's not cool. Don't do it. Instead, you'll have a prompt on your real AP World History test that looks a little bit like this. Evaluate the extent to which the attitudes of Christian and Islam towards merchants and trade from the religion's origins until about 1500 was similar. That's the kind of prompt that you're going to get. Evaluate the extent to which, and it's going to have a keyword like similar, different, affect, transform, change, something for you to hone in on to know what your answer will be. Just one more reminder before we go into yesterday's homework, which is that next week, we're going to do something a little bit special. On Monday and Wednesday, we're going to proctor an AP question. That AP question will be just like what you will do on your real AP test. It will have the right prompt, and it will only have 5 documents. And then on Tuesday and Thursday, we are going to review and give good ideas and bad ideas to help you better understand what was the deal, how to do a good job with those DBQs. And then Friday, Mr. Logereau and I are going to come together to finally determine which one of us is okay, we're giving that up because obviously neither one of us is cool. So we're going to come together to give you some tips and tricks and talk about ways for you to be successful and to celebrate your opportunities that you have this year and the end of our AP live streaming sessions. All right, let's get into our homework. Yesterday, Mr. Logereau gave you 2 documents and asked you to do a source analysis on each of these documents. So look at this one for document 1. It says, Mukherjee does mention the decline in production of hand-woven cloth. However, as an economist writing about the entire Indian economy, he chose to focus on the money being made by shareholders, investors, and financiers in machine-made cloth factories, because that is where most of the money is being invested. He does not consider those people who can no longer make cloth at home and the economic cost for the lower classes of India. This is a good example of how sometimes, to analyze the source, you can look at what's not in the document rather than what is in the document. In this case, Mr. Laugereau looked at the source line to sound that the foundation of Indian economics must mean that he's writing about the entire Indian economy. So we've looked at his purpose and a bit of his point of view, and I highlighted that part of the response in yellow for you. But remember, doing historical situation, intended audience, purpose, or point of view is not enough. You can do one of those or some of those, remember, because it's a toolbox and you use whatever tool you need to be successful, but it's not enough. There has to be a second step, what we've been calling the so what step. In this case, the so what step talks about how he focuses on a more elite group of the economics and not the effects on the lower part of the Indian economy. Let's take a look at a picture, which can oftentimes be hard to identify the source, but is absolutely possible, even when it's a picture, to look at the source and analyze that source. Here it says, since this picture is from the company itself and its official history, they would want to put a happy face on their factory. They can show clean, uncrowded workspaces, as opposed to the more dangerous and dirty working conditions of many factories in Asia and Europe. This uses both point of view and a little bit of historical situation. At the top, I highlighted in yellow the idea of point of view, but I didn't highlight, because I didn't think of it till just now, that at the end of this paragraph, it actually does use a little bit of historical situation by adding in the fact that, in fact, these factories don't look like this. Most of the time, the conditions were terrible. They were dirty, they were crowded, they were dangerous. And so, because this is coming from the official company history, that's the historical situation and the point of view of the author, the source. But what's the so what? The so what is that it puts on a happy face, that it creates an illusion that might necessarily not be true, because we know that most factories did not look like this. Okay. Let's get into today's lesson and understand a little bit more. Today and the rest of the week, we're moving on from Unit 5 and we're focusing on Unit 6, which is the last unit that your AP World History 2020 DBQ could cover. Because remember, your AP World History 2020 only DBQ can only be from Units 1 to 6, which means from the years 1200 to 1900. So, I'm going to show you two pictures. I want you to describe what you see, and I want you to ask yourself the question, what is imperialism? And use evidence from the image to support your answer. I'm going to give you just about 25 to 30 seconds with each image, and then I'm going to move on. Okay, so down here we can see that the platform that this man is standing on is actually shaped like Africa. And so this must be Africa. And over here you have Madagascar. And then we see that he's standing from the southernmost tip of Africa over to Egypt in the northernmost part of Africa. And also you might have known that he doesn't look like he's African. And if you can tell, it says down here, the Rhodes Colossus. And Rhodes doesn't necessarily sound like an African name to me. This is actually a drawing of a man named Cecil Rhodes. Many people wonder what he's carrying or holding across from foot to foot. And the answer is he's holding a telegraph wire. So what is the answer to the question? What does this have to do with imperialism? Well, imperialism must be, oh, by the way, did we also notice that he's holding a gun? And in case he needs it. So imperialism is clearly something involving Europeans or white people ruling over, controlling Africa and using it or creating some sort of using technology or using it to make connections of some kind. Obviously, as we continue looking, though, we're going to have more specific answers to this question. So let's keep looking. 30 more seconds. All right, this map gives us a much better idea about what imperialism is, especially if you took the time to look at the key. At the key, it says specifically territory controlled by, and then it lists European states and the United States. So imperialism seems to be the United States and Europe branching out and expanding their territory and control around the world. I would point out to you that this is not actually showing us around the world. We learned, at the beginning of Unit 5 on Friday with Mr. Logereau that most of the Western Hemisphere, the United States of America, parts of the Caribbean, Latin America, all of those regions rebelled against their European rulers in the late parts of the 1700s and the early parts of the 1800s. And what we see here is predominantly imperialism taking place in Africa and Asia, in particular, South and Southeast Asia. Also notice there's very, very, very little territory belonging to two of the most dominant states of the previous era. Previously, the two of the most dominant states of the period 1450 to 1750 were Portugal and Spain. But when we look at this map and our understanding of imperialism, we see very little Portugal and very little Spain. As a matter of fact, we see even less Portugal than we do Spain. What that means is that imperialism from the period 1750 to 1900 is mostly about other countries, especially Britain and France, but also Belgium and the Netherlands and even Germany. So we see a lot of new regions of the world expanding their territory, and we see the influence of Spain and Portugal decrease significantly through this period. So let's get into our lesson a little bit. What are we going to talk about? Today we're going to talk about rationales for imperialism. We're going to look at specific examples and methods of state expansion, and we're going to look at some examples of resistance to imperialism. So let's dig in. First of all, we're going to continue doing the activity we did from earlier today. I'm going to give you about 20 seconds, and I want you to, in your notes or just in your mind or out loud to your parents or whatever you want, however you're doing this, I want you to describe what you see. Look for meaningful details. And then I want you to think, what does this show us about the rationale, what ideologies led to imperialism? And use evidence from the image to support your answer. I'm going to give you about 20 seconds each. I'm going to scroll through them one by one. And then we're going to go one at a time. Just kidding. I just changed my mind on the spot. Okay, let's go. Okay, so here's some things that you probably should have noticed as you were looking at the picture. First of all, it's clearly a staged picture. And as you look at the picture, you notice that they're on some kind of a break. But if you look at the description at the bottom, you know that it's a gold mining company. It's obvious here that there are both black and white people in the picture, but there's a very distinct difference in the way they're dressed. And you don't really see a lot of the white people holding tools or yeah, they don't look like they're holding tools. So what do we see, or what ideology do we get from this? Well, one of the most important things to understand from this is that one of the rationales was simply the extraordinary amount of resources that were available in Africa and Asia. Particularly in Africa, some of the resources included gold and diamonds, which Europeans loved as an expression of luxury and wealth. But also, very significantly, was the existence of palm oil in Africa, a natural African resource that Europeans could use in their factories back home to keep machines oiled and to avoid problems like rust, which would require replacement. So it's a very important factor for industrialization. Let's look at another image. Take about 20 seconds to look at this image and try to think about details. Okay, so I want to point out a couple of details here. Here and here, we can actually see that the people doing some of the most intensive labor are African people, while it seems like there's even time for European people to sit back and rest. But also there's a pretty graphic image here where we can see that the European person is actually using physical abuse in order to punish or maybe even encourage the worker to continue working. This shows us another ideology or rationale for imperialism. This rationale for imperialism is forced labor. As Europeans imperialized and took control in Africa and Asia, they oftentimes required the indigenous people in those territories to do the work, the hard labor necessary for mining and agriculture and other types of economic extraction. Europeans, as we said, used this territory in order to extract raw materials for their industrial process back in Europe, and they often had forced labor in order to do that. One of the most famous examples of forced labor not seen in this picture is what's called corvée labor, a type of labor that was used, for example, in order to force Egyptians to build the Suez Canal and help Europeans more easily get from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean without having to go all the way around Africa. This is a type of labor that was used by the French and the British in order to force Egyptians, almost as a form of taxation, to participate in the work and do most of the work of building the Suez Canal. Take about 15 to 20 seconds with this picture. Something you might have noticed here is that when you look at the people at the bottom of the image, you can see that they seem to be segregated. But Africans seem to be on one side of the flag, while Europeans seem to be on another side of the flag. And there doesn't seem to be much assimilation in terms of cultures, because Europeans seem to be wearing very uniquely European clothes, and Africans seem to be very African-looking clothes. But the center of the image is not the people at all. You have to pay pretty specific attention in order to get into those people, because the center of this image is the flag. And the flag is a commonly used symbol of nationalism. A flag is an opportunity to express ownership over a territory, and it's an opportunity to express pride in one's country. Another rationale or justification for European imperialism was European nationalism. Empires wanted to grow and expand, not only to expand their economies, but also to demonstrate their strength as an empire. Let's look at another picture. Okay, so when you're looking at this picture, there's a few things that you can probably tell right off the bat. You can probably see here that there's one person, maybe a teacher, maybe a leader, and that one person is standing in front of everyone else. You can also see next to this person that there's somebody playing, well, it looks like playing an instrument. Well, obviously a piano, that's not a trombone. Okay, so somebody playing an instrument. So this is some sort of classroom or learning session. These definitely look at least somewhat like children over here. And also notice that there's some sort of uniform to what the African people are wearing. You can even see some degree of assimilation, it looks like, in what the people are wearing. But I would also point out that as you look, you can look in the background and you can see pretty uniquely Christian looking images, possibly even posters of Jesus. This is an example of the importance of Christianity in the rationale for imperialism. Imperialism was about money, and it was about power, and it was about wealth, and it was about pride in their country, but imperialism was also about spreading the gospel, spreading the Christianity, and spreading the Christian message into places where it had never been. Okay, take about 20 seconds to look at this image. Okay, this image shows, this image depicts an ideology called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was based off faulty and false science that told people that the whiter the person, the more evolved that race was. And so that as a form of evolution, race was demonstrative of evolution. It was based off of Charles Darwin's ideas about survival of the fittest, although Charles Darwin denounced social Darwinism and was not a part of its philosophies. So social Darwinism demonstrated the idea that the white person was scientifically, although again, it was based off of a faulty, bad science. It was an ideology that believed that the white person was superior to non-white people, and that there was also a progression of non-white people. This gave white people, particularly Europeans who were interested in imperialism, a justification and a rationale to go after that. Imperialism was about conquering people who were less than them, and therefore not some sort of moral problem, but actually some sort of moral good that was being done. Take a look at this next picture. Well, actually, it's a poem, a stanza from a poem, and see if it further explains the understanding that many Europeans had about imperialism. Rudyard Kipling was British, and he wrote this poem to the Americans at the finish of what was called the Spanish-American War. After the Spanish-American War, the Americans had beat Spain and therefore were granted certain Spanish territories. One of those important territories was the Philippines in Southeast Asia. When the United States had control of the Philippines, the Filipinos immediately demanded something called self-determination. They wanted the right to decide how they should be ruled. And so Rudyard Kipling wrote this poem published in an American magazine, encouraging the Americans not to grant the Filipinos self-determination, but instead to colonize the Philippines. Look at how he refers to the Philippines in the bottom part. Look at my underlining skills in the bottom part of this document. He says, "Your new caught sullen peoples," and then he refers to them as half devil and half child. This is the whole idea of social Darwinism, that because Filipinos were darker and a different race than Europeans, Americans, or British, they therefore were less superior and actually needed the help of the Americans, and that help could only come through colonization. Here, take a look at another image to help you better understand this same idea. I'll give you about 20 seconds. Okay. So this is an actual advertisement, like a commercial, just like, when you're watching Hulu and commercials pop up, or if you're watching like TV, this is just a commercial for soap. But look at this soap. It's actually talking about how they can use Pear soap in order to teach cleanliness. This is a part of the white man's burden, to actually take this soap into new civilizations and demonstrate cleanliness to different people, to Africans and Asians. This is what we also refer to. Take this last picture. Let's take a look at one more picture and see if we can get a full, complete idea here. So, looking at this picture, you see images of Uncle Sam and a man who represents Great Britain, and you see them holding up people from territories where they've expanded. You have Native Americans in the basket for Uncle Sam. You have a Cuban in the basket for Uncle Sam. In the basket for Britain, you see Indians, you see Chinese, and you can tell that those images, the way that they're not drawn in order to respect or dignify, but rather to insult and to oppress those people in those pictures. And look at what these Native Asian and Africans are being carried over. They're being carried over ignorance. They're being carried over vice, which means wrongdoing, over brutality, over slavery, as if the Americans and the British are saving these people from these problems. And they're carrying them to civilization. Together, these ideas of the white man's burden and the soap and this cartoon, and even this last picture where you see a white woman, a European woman teaching Burmese in Southeast Asia women, all of these together make up the idea of the civilizing mission. The fact that imperialism wasn't really about conquering people and taking advantage of them and using them for their resources. It was about teaching them civilization and civilizing them, bringing them religion and discipline and cleanliness. This was a way to justify imperialism and to take it from what it truly was, which was exploitation and violence, and make it look like something else. Teaching discipline and making people better. Okay, let's take some time to look at some examples of imperialism. First of all, some states strengthened their control or assumed direct control over their colonies where non-state entities existed. We'll talk about at least 2 examples of that. States used both warfare and diplomacy in order to expand their territories. Europeans established settler colonies, meaning sometimes they came in and they exploited the native people, but most of the time the only white or European people who were living there were military or government officials. And sometimes, as in the case of South Africa or New Zealand and Australia, they actually came in and pushed out segregated and oppressed native peoples in order to establish white-led governments and societies that modeled European society. Though most of the imperialism was over through maritime expansion, states like the United States and Russia, and even Japan, expanded by conquering and settling neighboring states. Although obviously Japan being a set of islands, when they conquered neighboring states, they also used maritime technology. Okay, let's get into some specific examples here. So in Africa, there's examples of states using both warfare and diplomacy. In British West Africa, for example, there was a state, part of Nigeria I'm stuttering. In West Africa, part of Nigeria was actually conquered through treaty with the king you can see here, King Jaja of Opopo. And so sometimes treaties were granted in order for the Europeans to take advantage of trade, and the Europeans offered mutually beneficial trade, but very rarely held up their end of the bargain. In France, in British West Africa, though, there was also an example of warfare as they conquered areas like Gambia and Lagos. The French created a settler colony in Algeria, which also became a very popular place for Italians and the Spanish to come and settle themselves. As Europeans began taking their trading posts where they had once had posts for trade, particularly as a part of the former slave trade, though by 1800, most European states had turned against the actual slave trade, if not slavery in their own states. Nonetheless, throughout the 1800s, Europeans began taking their trading posts and expanding them into colonies. And by 1885, the leader of Germany began to get worried that this would actually lead to conflict between Europeans. So he called European leaders to Berlin, and they held the Berlin Conference of 1885. You can look in the picture on the right, and you can see in the picture on the right that there's a lot of people at the Berlin Conference, and they have a map of Africa that they're looking at and that they're dividing up amongst themselves in order to peacefully organize who should get what part of Africa. However, it's important to note who's missing from this picture. Not a single African leader was consulted or concerned with at the Berlin Conference, and not a single concern for African needs or unique African abilities, for African tribes, for African customs, for African religious beliefs. All of those things were completely disregarded because the concern of the people at the Berlin Conference was actually African resources and the best way to extract those resources. This is further proven by the fact that at the Berlin Conference, not only did they decide who would get what parts of Africa, but they also agreed to mutually shared rivers in order for different states to have access to transportation of resources out of Africa. Just take a look at this image that attempts to show the many different ethnic, religious, and cultural boundaries of Africa. Of course, in most cases, especially in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, these aren't borders as much as they just demonstrate where people lived and stayed. Contrast this to the African territories and how they were conquered by European states. After the Berlin Conference, European states conquered Africa with absolutely no regard for African customs, cultures, and ethnicities. And this would create problems for the rest of history in Africa. One famous example of colonization in Africa came in the Congo. Congo was personally owned by King Leopold, who was the king of Belgium. Belgium had a separate government from the king, and that government did not have direct control over Belgium. Instead, it was the Congo. And in the Congo, King Leopold had an extraordinarily and even possibly uniquely example of brutality used against the people of the Congo in order to extract the goods that were particularly important there. Because King Leopold benefited in today's dollars more than $1 billion annually from his collection of goods like ivory and rubber in the Congo. Activists began to give examples throughout Belgium of the types of abuse. You can see in this picture children whose hands were cut off because their parents or leaders in their society were unable to meet the quota necessary to actually get enough of the rubber or ivory or other products demanded by King Leopold. As a result, King Leopold, which was considered a non-state entity, lost control of the colony as the government of Belgium took direct control over it, ending many of the extreme abuses, but obviously not ending abuse at all, because colonization is in fact a form of abuse. It creates a system where African people are forced to do labor in order to extract their resources for the benefit of the Europeans. But this is an example, as we spoke before, of imperialism, of the spread of European control, including non-state entities losing control to state entities. It's important to know that Africans mostly didn't just accept this kind of imperialism, but that there were different examples of Africans actually committing resistance against European imperialism. Two famous examples of African states leading to resistance against the European imperialism included the Sokoto Caliphate in West Africa and the Zulu Kingdom in Southern Africa. There were also examples of African-led rebellions against European leaders. For example, in the Xhosa cattle killing movement was an example of the Xhosa people killing more than 400,000 cows and also destroying crops as a part of their animistic belief that it would lead to spirits rising up and attacking the Europeans. Another example is the West African warrior Samori Touré, who was able to lead several rebellions against West African imperialism. Imperialism also existed in South Asia. In South Asia, all the way back to the 1500s, we know that Europeans were highly interested in the Indian spice trade and engaging in the Indian spice trade. We also know from our lessons back in Unit 3 that the Mughal Empire suffered from having an unclear system set up of advancement to the throne and having lots and a very diverse society with lots and lots of Mughal princes all throughout their empire. The British East India Company, which was a company, not a government entity, actually took advantage of this by creating various alliances with the princes. Here you actually see an example of a British East India Company member signing a deal with an Indian prince. This deal allows the Europeans to collect taxes from the Indians, but you can see that the Europeans are clearly still granting some form of reverence to the Indian ruler who is sitting up elevated above the European leaders, even though it's a deal that clearly benefits and gives power to the British East India Company. Throughout the 1800s, the British East India Company continued to gain control of India, and by 1850, it had total control of India. However, in 1857, there was an extraordinary example of Indian resistance and rebellion against the British East India Company. This came in what is often called the Sepoy Mutiny. A Sepoy was an Indian member of the British East India Company Army. And remember, a feature of imperialism was disrespecting the customs and the cultures of native people, specifically the religious ideas of the native people, because Europeans believed that native people should convert to Christianity. Since a feature of imperialism was disrespecting the customs and the culture of the native people, the British East India Company had very little regard for the rules of both Hinduism and Islam, and they forced sepoys to carry new ammunition and weaponry that disrespected some of the most pertinent rules of Hinduism and Islam. In particular, Hindus were required to carry something made of cow, which is considered sacred in Hinduism, and Muslims were required to carry something made of pig, which is unclean in Islam. For many sepoys, this was going too far. This was the British East India Company going too far, and so they rebelled against the British Indian Company. This rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful, but it was not the British East India Company that was able to stop the rebellion. Instead, they called upon the government of Britain, and the British military came in and put down the Sepoy Mutiny. This is another example of not only Britain of European states using warfare, but also an example of non-state entities losing their control to the state power. Because after 1857, the British government took direct control over the Indian colony. Both the United States and Russia had expansion through the form of land-based expansion. You may have heard of or remember learning about something called manifest destiny, or the idea that spreading from one ocean to the other ocean was actually God's plan for and the destiny of Americans. It's important to remember, though, that this idea required the forceful removal of Native Americans, in particular through ways like the Indian Removal Act after the rebellion of the Cherokee Nation, and maybe most famously through the Indian Trail of Tears. The Russian Empire also expanded its empire, annexing many states in Eastern Europe and building an empire all the way across to Alaska until they sold Alaska to the United States of America. Okay, let's take a look at some things and review what we've learned today. So, let's look at both reasons and justifications for imperialism. I'm distinguishing, even though they're all a part of the idea of rationales for imperialism, I'm slightly distinguishing the two as a historian to say some were the reasons why Europeans went into Africa and Asia and conquered, and others were reasons that they used to make it not so bad or to hide the exploitation. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to brainstorm here. All right, so here's what you should have come up with. Labor and resources. For example, sorry, let me say this. Labor and resources, we talked about forced labor like corvée labor in the Suez Canal. We talked about mining for gold and diamonds, and we talked about the importance of palm oil for the industrial process in Europe. Spreading Christianity. Social Darwinism, which remember was a bad and fake science that taught European people that white race was the superior race. Of course, industrialization and the need for resources to feed into the industrial process. As a matter of fact, Unit 6 is all about imperialism, but it's called The Consequences of Industrialization, which is important to remember that one of the most important driving forces for imperialism is the industrial process. Industrialization gave Europeans the technologies that they needed in order to be successful in industrialization. It also gave them the technologies they needed in order to want to so extraordinarily exploit Africa and Asia for their resources. The civilizing mission, the idea that it wasn't just their ability, that they weren't just able to conquer, but that it was their responsibility, because they weren't conquering, they were bringing discipline and civilization. And of course, nationalism. Okay. So look at each of these four claims that we started with today, and let's come up with some examples that we learned throughout our process today. So again, I'm going to give you about let's give you about a minute to look at each of these claims and come up with examples from what we discussed today. Okay, let's go over some of these ideas. States strengthened their control or assumed direct control over colonies where non-state entities existed. We learned about the Congo, how the Belgian government took control from King Leopold and his personal ownership. And we learned about India and the British East India Company losing control to the British government. States used both warfare and diplomacy to expand. We got examples of that in British West Africa. Europeans established settler colonies. We learned about French Algeria, and we also learned about New Zealand and Australia. And of course, we learned about I knew I was missing something there, you guys. We learned about the Berlin Conference as a form of diplomacy and also the resistance to European expansion that led to warfare. We learned about manifest destiny in the United States. All right. You're going to continue to look at and review African responses and resistance to European imperialism as you do your practice tonight. So I'm giving you the exact same assignment I asked you to complete on Monday, but instead you're working with a totally different set of documents. So read the 3 documents this time. Sorry about that. Read the 3 documents this time and write a paragraph. Start with a topic sentence, try to use at least 2 documents to support your claim, attempt to analyze the source of at least 1 document, and add evidence from outside. Who says outside the brain? You guys, I clearly spent way too much time today listening to Beyonce and not proofreading this document. But your other piece of homework is, if you haven't heard it yet, go listen to the remix, the Savage remix. It's supposedly Megan Thee Stallion featuring Beyonce, but we're just going to call it the Beyonce remix. No, Megan Thee Stallion is great too. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to stop because it's getting weird. I hope you guys have a great night. We can't wait to see you guys again tomorrow. Don't forget, Monday and Wednesday of next week, we're going to bring to you DBQs and do our best to simulate the testing process and then go over those DBQs the next day, followed by a celebration with both Mr. Logereau and I on Friday. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.